Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. A fascinating report out by CHRI, a non-profit organization, has documented the lives and times and trials and tribulations of journalists working from the northeastern part of India. Remember, it's a space that has seen perhaps every form of difficulty and challenge possible, whether it is insurgency, whether it was the citizenship related protests, whether it is, of course, the question of diversity and discrimination, and much, much in terms of violence. What are the challenges that journalists working from there face, both from mainstream media and within the region itself? Joining me to talk about all of that is Sanjoy Hazarika. He's an author, senior journalist, and international director at CHRI, and Sangeeta Barooah Pisharoty, who is deputy editor at the Wire. Thank you both for joining in, Sangeeta and Sanjoy. I want to start with, a bit of a snapshot feeling, I think, before we get really deep into the nuances of the report. Sanjoy, if I may start with you, what comes to mind when you talk about the peculiarities, the nuances, or the specificities of reporting from the northeastern part of India?
Well, it's just that it keeps getting so complicated. I'm sure that your colleague will also tell you that, you think that you actually understood the problem, and then it's like peeling an onion. There are more and more layers and more issues and more challenges. So you're constantly learning, you can never say that you really know a situation in the depth that you could or should. So it's a constant learning process. And that's where I think the gap lies between the rest of India still, although there is much more interest in the region for various reasons, political and otherwise. But I think one of the key things that I think puts a lot of media from the rest of the country off is that you have to take a deep dive. You can't parachute. Still, the parachute form doesn't work, whether it's on issues which are in the headlines today, or it's a long-term view that you're going to take. And we have to be patient, learn, and really do our research well. That's I'm very glad nowadays. In the last few days, I've been having calls from people who in different media houses, and I say that you should read this. I said, okay, we'll read it and get back to you. So those who are interested are engaged and focused. So that's encouraging to see.
Sangeeta, same question to you. I mean, do you agree with the fact that it is, of course, extremely layered, but B, it's also ever intense, right? The intensity levels of reporting from this region are so high.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to begin by, reading out a line that I really liked in this report of CHRI. It says that, Northeast India, with its plethora of languages and ethnicities and complex socio-political history, presents a terrain that is difficult and expensive to navigate. Within this space, journalism is often stereotyped and homogenized by metro media, despite the variety and diversity. I think in that line, there's a lot of indication, about what you are asking me, So it's that, that it's so layered, as you said, it's not nobody can say that I'm an expert on this subject or on this state, or because things are so fluid and keep changing. Look at the Assam-Mizoram border issue. There's so many nuances to it. If you want to cover from the government angle, okay, there's a government angle. If you want to cover it from the border people angle, then there's a border people story. If you want to cover it from the people of the two states, so that's something again different. From the historical point of view, it is again different. There's so many complexities to this, So it's very important to, as Sanjoy Hazarika said, the deep dive is very important. I don't quite agree that sometimes it's also necessary for say reporters from Delhi to go and cover these stories, but when you do that, you need to give time to it. You need to be able to cover all angles. It cannot be just a one angle story. Often it is the case, I've just found whenever any other state, I belong to Assam, but if I go to say cover a story in Manipur or in Arunachal, I need time to do even one story because I need to listen to all sections of it. And that's why the stories usually, when we write these stories from the Northeast, they're usually very long, because you have to bring in so many perspectives. Yeah. And people whose stories are not very often told, they're also very, very conscious, of their, what you write, and very conscious of their facts, and they can come after you actually.
Yeah. Sanjay, Sangeeta raises an important point. And before we talk about some of the findings of the CHRI report, I just wanted to get your thoughts as well on this situation between Assam and Mizoram, where, of course, there are lines and lines to draw in terms of history. But I think what's taken people by surprise is the fact that for the first time, there are two states that have an internal conflict that boiled over to this extent. Do you sense that there is some kind of tipping point at this point when you look at the situation in the northeast of India? Have things changed from before, or have they always been extremely tenuous and vulnerable?
I think they've always been fairly vulnerable. I think this is not the first time there's been a conflict on the border. I'm not talking about Mizoram and Manipur and Assam, and then there are conflicts with four states. So, and these have been going back, 30, 40 years. So there is, even if we don't want to look at the historical thing, it's not contemporary. It goes back in time, and it depends on the very different perspectives that people have, governments have, the lines they draw, the documents they consult, the laws that they follow. Everything is complex, as I said earlier. And it's really a challenge to navigate this and to do it in a coherent but also in a very balanced way, and that is the real challenge.
Let me dive into some of the report findings now. The first one that struck me was when you documented and talked about violence against journalist deaths. And the figures actually look quite concerning. In Northeast India, for example, and this is what the report finds, the scenario is even more fraught. I'm quoting from the report. Senior journalists from the region face an unnerving range of challenges. Assault, death threats, murder. In addition, management is not supportive, and they preferred not to renew the job contracts of reporters and editors or discourage them from reporting on sensitive cases. Just walk us through, what you all found when you went out and started speaking to journalists, and whether there was a trend to it in terms of a timeline from when this had begun, or any other specific observation.
See, I think that this has grown over a period of time. It's not something that's happened overnight, whether it's like the border issues. And you have to see it in the larger context. You can't, although the issues in the Northeast are different and the challenges in some degree are sharper, and some of the challenges do not exist elsewhere in the country. You'll also have to look at the larger perspective of what's happening across India in this rather fraught situation.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that when I was thinking of this report and the stories, because it's told through the stories of five really senior journalists. I mean, we have other people who are interviewed for the process, but it is their voices speaking, in a way, truth to power, truth to their own kin. And one thing that comes out time and again, since you've read the report, is the issue of wellness, mental wellness, dealing with trauma. And this comes increasingly among people who are attacked, who are trolled, who are physically face threats and have physically been attacked. And in other cases have faced other verbal threats, as you've mentioned. And that, to me, is one of the core learnings from this report, is in addition to the physical things, what's come out very clearly, like in the whole pandemic situation, is that mental wellness and trauma is a key problem and challenge that we have to tackle. And you need counseling, you need support. And often people don't get that support either from each other because they don't know what it is, what the problem is, as Tongam Rina talks about it in her very powerful testimony, because these are testimonies of individuals who shared their problems very honestly and with great, not just candor, but it's really a very powerful sharing that they do. I would say that is really at the top of everything else.
Yes, many parts of it are quite raw, I think, in their honesty. Sangeeta, let me ask you the same question in a different way, because, what also struck me was the point the journalist made about the fact that they didn't get any support from the management when they tried to do stories that were impactful. There's been a progression within the Northeast, just like India, in terms of where you started with print, and that goes, really way back for the northeastern part of India. There's television, of course, and now there's a couple of specific digital platforms that are trying to report around that region. Do you sense this frustration across your journalist community, regardless of where they work, paper, TV, digital, or do you think there's a difference over there?
This is there across, but as you said, the digital media has somewhere come as a kind of, an easier way perhaps to tell stories, and not through, the print and the traditional media has been there, but then they always said, look at only one set of stories. And also what Sanjoy has said about the threat perspective. Okay, so it's because of that, the report also has highlighted very well that very few investigative stories are done. They are not very willing. And here it is also important to note what journalist Teresa Rahman has said in the report. She said that it is sometimes very important to do parachute journalism in the Northeast, because that I myself has faced. A lot of my journalist friends who were, say, stationed in Manipur or Arunachal or Assam, even Sikkim, they just call me and say, there's a story like this, why don't you do it? We can't do this. They will help you out with the story. You go do your reporting, come back. But I always try to give credit to them, because they are the ones who are actually at the front line. I have huge respect for that lot, because they hardly get, they're not well paid. They don't have any health insurance. They have, some of these guys, they just are paid. Their starting salary is about 2,000 rupees. Yeah. There is Diganta Sharma has talked about in the meeting. So this is what we are talking about. This is the reality. And you must respect the kind of the enthusiasm that they have to tell a story. And sometimes they cannot go forward because they are not given that backing from by their employers. So, and a couple of times I have seen now with digital media, they have actually moved, the journalists have moved to this medium to start something on their own, because they basically want to do journalism. That trend that we have seen nationally also, but a lot of these, I think, things they are picking up also from these trends from what is happening in the national media. So I'm very glad that digital media is actually giving people some sort of, scope and a platform to do the kind of journalism that they want to do. Because there are quite a few of them who are very brave. They just take on it. Sanjay has mentioned Tongam Rina. She'd taken a bullet, So that's what we are talking about.
Yeah. Sanjay, this point about parachute reporting is also interesting because of another, finding in the report where we talk more and more about local reportage, but I was struck by how locals within the region are often quite suspicious of the reportage because of the political nuances to it. For example, for Manipur, they found that people are very wary of citizen journalism and mobile journalism enterprises. They question the inclusivity of any new community or any local media organization. That makes it a much tougher terrain to be reporting under, right? You're up against perhaps a state. You're up against, talking truth to power, but you're also up against this whole thing that's brewing in the land itself.
Yeah, I mean, so if you go back to something that's happening right now,
Yeah.
whether it's on the borders or whatever, it all comes back to the question of trust. You know, who do you trust in this kind of very rapid fire journalism, uh, where people don't have the time and they're competing with each other? Often it is not journalists who are competing with other journalists, but it's people who think of themselves as citizen journalists, you know, and in the process they can get things really terribly wrong. um, and I think it's very, that's why I go back to what I was saying in the beginning, the need for really a deep dive constantly to be open to learning, you know, and to reading and to talking to people. You know, we the I think the way I I think Sangeeta also has done this. You know, basically you do a lot of foot slogging, because in very conflicted situation you go on the basis, this has always been in conflicted situation, go by the a basic fundamental, which is that nobody's telling the truth, everybody is lying to some degree. And if you actually follow that principle, if you can call it, you'll actually get nuances that will help you understand the thing. And I think the other thing which helps us all to navigate better is to, if we speak the language, like in Assam, I think Sangeeta and I can get along very well because we speak Assamese. But in other places, you know, in Arunachal, as you know, Hindi is the state language. But in Nagaland, one can get along by speaking Nagamese, and so on. But it is very important to also understand the nuances which are uh, pos- placed before us, or placed in terms of describing a situation in the local language, in the language of the state. And that I think is really critical.
Yeah, I want to ask you this quick question as well, Sanjay, before I get to other findings of the report. What struck me while I was reading it was how little, as a business journalist, I had read in terms of economic or business reportage from the region in the last decade or more than that. I literally could not think of the big 4 or 5 business stories or economic stories that had come out from there. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a very important point actually you raised. I was thinking of mentioning this, because normally what happens is that the region, even if we see from the metro media or New Delhi media point of view, what is asked for is what is being fed to the system. Normally the stories that you are they want, basically they get space for, even in the traditional media. There's a crunch for space. I mean, in television there's crunch for space. So if you talk to the colleagues stationed in all the northeastern states, mostly in Assam, the national media representatives, they always say that we send a story when we know that this will get space. Okay, so what gets space? It's actually normally the bad news. There'll be about upspa, there'll be about conflict. Look how the Assam Mizoram story was covered across. But where do we get to see stories from, say, about the culture, about, as you said, about business? We don't. But some of us like to also, now we push for this. Whenever we get time or anything, we try that with Wire, try to get in touch with people. That you must write about what this particular food or culture or everything. But I also here want to mention about an initiative that's taken by Indian Express, which is laudatory. Its correspondent Dora Agarwala in Guwahati has been consistently writing about music, culture. So that's something, because how do you know? How will the rest of India identify with this huge, lot of people who are such diversity, there? So how do you know about them? Now you know about them only through, how many people died, what is the next disaster that's going to happen. But what about their culture, the rich food culture, their weaves, so many, over 250 tribes live there, So this is what I think that it's a very pertinent question you have asked. We need to break into through that, somewhere some effort will have to be done in that aspect.
But going to the economics of it, Mitali, this is something that, for instance, take a very simple thing. The broomstick, the charu that people use in Delhi and buy for 20, 30 rupees in INA or wherever they buy. The charu is actually from parts of Meghalaya. It's cultivated here and it's shipped there. It's a great story. It helps sustain communities, villages, a local rural economy. And I think one of the reasons why there hasn't been good, adequate, shall we say, business or financial, economic reporting from the region is that it has always been seen as essentially enclave industries, tea, oil, gas, But I think there has been some work which has been done because of the Look East and now the Act East policy and the whole region opening up to Southeast Asia, connecting and all that. But I always say there are caveats here. For instance, if you open up borders to other countries, you'll get good things coming, you'll get bad things also coming. That's one. The second thing is that if you want to connect to Southeast Asia, you have to deal with Burma, Myanmar. I mean, you can't jump over Myanmar. You have to, and most trade, unfortunately, is on the, as you know, on the high seas, on the oceans, and railroads and roads are only can take a fraction of that international cargo movement. So I think that what people do not also see is that how the supply chain is affected by events like conflicts within a region or whether it's border conflicts, the current one or previous ones. Yeah. Because people watch what is happening. You have citizen journalists or other journalists, you have media, these stories go viral. They land on a potential investor's table. And he's going to think and say, okay, do I really want to put my money there? So I think the nuances often get lost because it's not seen as part of a larger, shall we say, framework. How many people know that Assam and the Northeast was actually a globalized area 150 years ago? It was the only part of India which was connected to the London markets. It was connected to Southeast Asia and to Africa through tea. Mm. The Brahmaputra was used to bring tea down to the markets of Calcutta and shipped out, but also it was used to bring in like the latest models of Studebakers and cars. They were. I'm just writing on the Brahmaputra, so a little bit of that. So it is used for two-way passage, so you need to look at all these areas in terms of both a historical perspective, but also what is there on the ground now. If you want these changes to come about, if you want people to write about them, you have to, everybody has to understand that the supply chain, ultimately, if you disrupt the supply chain, it affects you.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that economic journalists, business journalists really should be focusing on.
Yeah, and I think supply chains are something that have really, again, come to the fore with this Assam and Mizoram conflict. Sangeeta, here was one problem that sounded quite familiar, which was about the dependency on single sources. And many of the journalists in the region saying that heavy dependence on government sources can become disadvantageous. Government officials with personal and political grudges exclude journalists from press conferences. If there's a report in a negative light, then they retaliate by refusing to provide quotes. Is this a new problem, or is this a long-standing problem for journalists in the region?
It's a general problem we face in Delhi. I face it in Assam and in other places. So that's very much there. In the last few years, it has gone up even more. They exclude you even from, the usual, your briefings or whatever. So that's very much there. But as journalists, our job is to also pester for it. And at least there are emails now. If they don't pick up the phone, you write an email. And if they don't respond, of course, we have to mention that they didn't respond, but at least we have to do our bit at the side. But having said that, the usual problem that journalists face in the region is also that you have to be in their good books. The good books is a very important thing, and mostly the men, they will be called for, say, a gathering by some officers or somebody, you go, but what about women journalists? Women journalists face this a lot, in the Northeast. I see, which Teresa has mentioned, I actually became very conscious of my gender when I started reporting on the Northeast. Because if I ask very politically swerve questions, very getting deeper into the issues, then they will ask you, are you interested in politics? Do you want to join politics? They want to ask you because you are a woman. And so, why are you so interested in this politics? So it's quite interesting. If you look back into the traditional system, the customary laws and all their boards, there's no space for women there, so you are the master within the four walls, you take all decisions, that way the women have more rights in the Northeast than the rest of India. But when it comes to the political space, it is not there, and so when as a woman journalist you ask these questions, they get a little conscious of this way. They don't look at you as a journalist first. So that is something I have come across. And then the other issue is also, suppose at 10 o'clock, 9 o'clock, you are sitting with all of your male journalists and you watch. So, it's not very normal. I haven't seen that as a very usual thing that they do. They are all the time conscious that there is a woman and she's not a journalist first, she's a woman. So that is something I have always come across in the Northeast. I have not seen this in any other parts so acutely than in the Northeast. I don't know why that is, but I think it is because of these customary laws and either how the system operates, the political space, or because normally journalism is also looked as a very political journalism. Journalism can be of all varieties, but there I often see that, it's all very political, so you do political stories. Yeah.
I'm running out of time,
but I also think a couple of other things. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily because of customary situations. I think that, for instance, a person like Patricia Mukim, she really carved a space for herself, which is quite unique in across in the country, really.
But she faces also.
Sorry, I was trying to say that in addition to the normal question and answer thing, I think what I find is important for people to use RTI. And that is something that somebody like Digonto Horma has used very extensively, and in a way has been facing pressure because of his very active use of RTI as a tool for investigative journalism. Because ultimately, if you get an RTI, even if there are delays, the response is from the horse's mouth. Yeah. It's actually the facts, and you can actually go and inspect a document. Even if you can't, and you can make copies of it, even if you can't take it, they won't share the whole information with you.
Yeah.
So there are ways of dealing with all these situations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I just want to add, Mitali, here, Sanjoy has mentioned about Patricia, but she's always also faced the heat because of taking on. And another important point to, highlight here is also that unlike other parts of the region, basically what you see in the north, in New Delhi and all, there are a lot of women in senior positions in the Northeast, in the media houses. That's something very, very unique, and I find it really very nice, that this has happened also. Yeah.
I am completely out of time, unfortunately, but one final question to you, Sanjoy, which really relates to some of what we are all living through, which is the online world, where many journalists have also indicated in this report that they feel more harassed and more intimidated. And we have seen a couple of those arrests happen on completely flimsy grounds. Do you see that as, sort of the real and present and most imminent danger for journalists within that region now?
No, it's one of the pressures, one of the threats. The but it's not the only real and
Is it
present
the
dangers. There
easiest?
are there
Is
are,
it
there
the
are many. It
easiest
is
to
one. It is one. It is because it's a question of how you also deal with it. No, it's how you cope with it, and I think that is where I think people like yourself, Sangeeta, and others can really help in mobilizing support in training people on how to deal with these issues, because I'm sure you've had to deal with them also. And I think that is the important. The digital space has brought in new challenges. It's opened up new opportunities. It's a question of navigating it better and learning how to do it. And we need to know how to do it better, from others and colleagues. And that would be really, I think, something that we would appreciate.
So it would. Thank you both so much for your time today. For anyone watching, it's a fascinating report. It's a very honest portrayal, and I recommend for everyone to go on to the CHRI website, download that report, and read about the challenges of reporting from Northeast India. Thank you both, Sangeeta and Sanjoy, for joining in today and with your time. And hopefully, this is a journey that people undertake with all the pitfalls that you noted out, but they follow through regardless. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.